Tommy Orange, the Cheyenne and Arapaho author of the novel There, features characters passed during the American Indian movement occupation of Alcatraz. This project will analyze the 19-month occupation of the island, bringing attention to the injustice confronting Native Americans. Jackie and her half-sister Opal Viola Victoria Bearshield recall their childhood experiences in the American Indian movement occupation of Alcatraz Island in Orange's novel There, where I first came introduced to the movement and interested in the history. Since the mid-1960s, American Indians had been on a mission to break into Alcatraz. After the famed prison shut its doors in 1963, Bay Area Native Americans began lobbying to have the island redeveloped as an Indian cultural center and school. The idea was for sovereignty and education, all those things that seemed easy for other people to get that we never had. Those were the things the idea was all about, says Eloy Martinez, a Southern Ute tribe elder who participated in the occupation in 1969. Reclaiming the rock became a rallying cry for Indians, many whom viewed the island as a symbol of government indifference toward the indigenous population. 5 Sioux landed on Alcatraz in March 1964 and tried to seize it under an 1868 treaty that allowed Indians to appropriate surplus federal land. These efforts failed. When an October 1969 fire destroyed San Francisco's American Indian Center, an activist group known as Indians of All Tribes set their sights on the unused land of Alcatraz. Protesters first journeyed to the island on November 9, 1969, under the leadership of Mohawk College student Richard Oakes. They only stayed for one night before the authorities removed them, but Oakes stressed that landing had been a symbolic act. If a one-day occupation by a white man on Indian land years ago established squatters' rights, then a one-day occupation of Alcatraz should establish Indian rights to the island, Oakes told San Francisco Chronicles. Indians of all tribes made a final attempt to seize Alcatraz in the early morning hours of November 20th, 1969. This time with an occupation force of 89 men, women, and children. The Indians landed at Alcatraz and claimed the island for all tribes of North America. Ignoring warning signs that their occupation was illegal, they moved into the old warden's house and guards' quarters and began personalizing the island. The Indians' first official proclamation to the public followed shortly therefore in a manifesto addressed to the Great White Father and all his people. In it, they stated the intentions to use the island for an Indian school, cultural center, and museum. They claimed Alcatraz was theirs by right of discovery, but they sarcastically offered to buy it for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, the same price that the Indians supposedly received for the island of Manhattan. The activists added they did not mind the island was underdeveloped or lacked fresh water, since most of them had already endured similar conditions on government Indian reservations. A government council was formed, and the island soon had its own clinic, kitchen, public relations department, and even a nursery and grade school for its children. Worry of a fallout that could accompany an attempt to remove the Indians by force, the Nixon administration opted to bide its time and leave the occupiers alone as long as they remained peaceful. Government officials later journeyed to the island on multiple occasions to negotiate. The activists were adamant that they would settle for nothing less than the deed to Alcatraz Island, while Government Services Administration and other agencies maintained that the transfer was impossible. By the early 1970s, however, life on the island had begun to change. Many of the movement's college students and organizers had to leave Alcatraz to return to school, and they were often replaced with people who cared more about living rent-free than fighting for protesters' original cause. Drugs and alcohol, both banned on the island, were soon circulating freely amongst certain members of the population. Oakes and his wife left Alcatraz after Oakes' young stepdaughter fell to her death from one of the prison stairwells in January of 1970. By May, the government had concluded that there was little hope for resolving the situation diplomatically, and the Nixon administration cut all remaining power to Alcatraz in an effort to force the Indians out. Only a few weeks later, a fire tore across the island, destroying several of Alcatraz's historic buildings. The Indians claimed the blaze was an incident or perhaps even the work of outside provocateurs. Government officials finally squashed the occupation on June 11, 1971, when armed federal marshals descended on the island and removed the last of its Indian residents. By then, the occupation force had dwindled to a skeletal crew of 6 men, 5 women, and 4 children. While the last protesters were forced to leave the island in defeat, the 19-month occupation has succeeded in galvanizing Indian activists. President Richard Nixon said, "The time has come for a new era in which Indian future is determined by Indian acts and the Indian decisions." The U.S. government later returned millions of acres of ancestral land and passed more than 50 legislative proposals supporting tribal self-rule. Today, the Rock has continued to serve as a focal point of Native American social campaigns. A pair of nationwide protests in 1978 and 1994 both began at the island, and since 1975, people have met at Alcatraz every November for an un-Thanksgiving Day to celebrate Indian culture and activism. Alcatraz is now property of the U.S. National Park Service.